Madam Chair, members of the committee, a week after Mr. Ansari's father was taken to the river and beaten and told to leave Brownsville, another man didn't have the opportunity to leave. Likely the same mob in the exact same place murdered Elbert Williams and threw him in the river. Mr. Williams is in the top left of that photograph. That is a photograph of some of the members of the NAACP chapter of Haywood County. Well, the remote's not liking me. But here is the result of the grand jury inquest. The bottom, it says the cause of death is believed to be foul means by persons unknown. We have here today Leslie McGraw. She's the great-grandniece of Elbert Williams. She's here to testify about the effect on her family of his June 20th, 1940 murder. I'll note that one of the effects of his murder is that someone like Mr. Ansari, the 10th child, is not here because he didn't have a chance to be born. But fortunately, there are still family members to tell Mr. Williams' story, and I invite Ms. McGraw to come to the podium and do so.
Good morning. As stated, I am the great-grandniece of the late Mr. Elbert Williams. Mr. Williams would have been 108
Excuse
next
me,
month.
please. Would you?
I will.
Okay.
I will. On October 15th. It is important to note that although he died before I was born, I was not taught to give a distinction between uncle and great-great-uncle within the family. This is why I will always refer to Uncle Elbert as Uncle Elbert instead of great-great-uncle. I also think it would be unfair to treat him as less of a family member because he died at 31 instead of 91, like many of my relatives. Who knows, he might have been a great uncle to me had he been allowed to breathe a few more years. In any case, I was asked to speak today from my heart on behalf of our family. Since my heart was way too full for the time we have today and writing is my preferred mode of communication, I wrote down a few thoughts about the general context of two topics, home and choices. So now about me, I think I'm important in this whole thing because his blood still runs through my veins. My name is Leslie Elaine McGraw. That's Leslie McGraw, McGraw. The story I've heard about my name is that my mom and dad were advised that I would be a boy, so they were going to name me Lester Wayne McGraw Jr. So since I chose to change the plan, they quickly adapted to the situation and chose to name me Leslie instead of Lester, and Elaine taking on my mother's middle name. McGraw is purportedly a hand-me-down from my paternal great-grandfather, an Irishman who went by the name of George McGraw. The amount of genealogy on my paternal side is impressive, but I don't have many personal connections. On the flip side, I was raised and deep-rooted in my maternal side, but don't have much connection to the larger genealogy. I've always been particularly connected to my grandmother, Bertha Louise Rowry. The eldest of 10 children, my grandmother was born almost 87 years ago to James Meady Taylor and Julia Williams Taylor in Brownsville, Tennessee. Meady Taylor was part of the large, well-known family in Brownsville. His brother Clarence owned a eatery where our family made everything. So all the food, the furniture was made, handmade. And some people claim that was the only place where a black man could go get a meal and pay a fair price for a meal and be treated like a man. There was also the Taylor Family Church, the Taylor Cemetery dating back to 1865, and a little community of homes. My great-grandmother, Julia, pronounced Julie Williams Taylor, was also the sister to the late Elbert Williams. So I think it's interesting to note that my grandmother and her youngest sibling, Sylvia, are the only two siblings still alive today. An interesting pair, my great aunt is actually younger than my mom. So they have shared parents and siblings, but their childhood connections are very different. My Aunt Sylvia, who lost both her parents before her 18th birthday, chose to name her only daughter, Julia, after her mother. Like many other families, Auntie made the choice to ensure her mother's name would not fade into obscurity. Brownsville, Tennessee was home for my grandma until she was 9, when she was forced to relocate to Michigan, first with her grandparents until her parents and siblings could come and meet her. Michigan was home until her kids were grown, and she remarried and relocated to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She has not set foot in Brownsville for more than 50 years. For the last 40 years, my grandmother has been one of my closest friends and confidants. When I was 2.5, my grandmother gave up her life in Milwaukee to move to Michigan to help my mom after she and my dad divorced. She lived with me and my mom until I was nearly 8, and then I saw her every day. Still, to this day, I've never lived more than 12 miles away from my grandma. This is a picture, real quick, of my grandmother and my mom and myself and my daughter. So the 4 generations are still here. With only 8 spotty years of education under her belt, she was engrossed in what I was learning. We played word games like Speak and Spell, crosswords. She taught me how to play cards and talk trash while I played them. Later, I found out she joined a local literacy program where she was matched with a mentor who helped strengthen her writing by putting her stories in book form. When my mom and other family members were home, we both played our part. I was the careful kid who didn't get in grown folks' conversations and business, and she was a matriarch who smoked cigarettes, baked cobblers, and calmed all confusion with a broom if she had to. But in the daytime, we were buds who shared our worlds. The highlights of our mornings was Little House on the Prairie. I know it's corny, but the reruns played twice each morning. We watched at least one episode every day. The show was good, but what was great was the accompanying stories my grandma would give. She would talk about her early life in Tennessee. She seemed to identify the most with Laura on the show. When Laura sisters blew out the kerosene lamp, Grandma would overtalk the show, talking about the lamps they used in their home in Brownsville. In my mind, I pictured Brownsville looking something like Walnut Grove, just with more brown people. She would often veer off and start talking about her family responsibilities as a small child on the farm. I still crack up every time she tells the story of how she devised a plan to get turkey more than once a year. Using a slingshot, she climbed up the tree and took a slingshot and hit the turkey right between the eyes. The first time her dad just chalked it up as an accident, and they ate turkey out of season. The second time a turkey met his fate, her dad knew something was up. He said, "Not nary another turkey better come up dead, or we gonna have an issue." So Grandma never publicly confessed to or denied killing the turkeys, but no more turkeys came up dead after that. Grandma often spoke on how her mom would help occasionally at the local laundry and what an excellent seamstress and presser she had been before a young apprentice accidentally dropped the ironing press on her hand and ruined her hand for good. My favorite adventure story was about how she was alone with her mom when she went into labor. Grandma Julie had to load my grandmother onto a horse when she was just 5 years old. She had to ride the horse several miles to fetch a midwife because, no hospital would take her. She made the trek and saved the day. In one episode of Little House, Laura was acting up in school. My grandma started telling me about a time the teacher paddled her hand so hard it had visible and painful welts on it. My great-grandfather drank a little dandelion wine for encouragement and then went up to the school and confronted the teacher. The teacher was advised to keep his hands, or both of their hands, off of my grandma from then on, and she complied, the head teacher. I probably heard the same 50 stories 500 times a day in different ways, and I loved every minute of it. I was able to catch a little glimpse of what she had grown through, and the people that were special to her. One day she told me a story about her Uncle Albert. She started often speaking of their trips to get ice cream. As the eldest child, she was often put in mature situations. When Uncle Elbert came around, she was able to be a little girl. I knew my great-grandfather James had 4 brothers, Uncle Clarence, Uncle Leonard, Uncle Verno, and Uncle Eldridge. All of them I had met before. I didn't recognize the name Elbert from any stories she'd ever told me. "Who's Uncle Elbert?" "Mama's brother," she said, looking off as if she could see him outside the window. "I didn't know your mama had a brother," I asked. "2. "Oh," before I could fix my mouth to ask their names, she replied, "Uncle Willie and Uncle Elbert." She started talking softer, and for a moment, it felt as though she just got really small, and she was speaking from the perspective of a child instead of my grandma. "They killed him." "Who killed who?" I asked. "They killed Uncle Elbert. He was working with the NAACP, trying to help folks with the voting registration. He came up missing." "The KKK?" I asked. She shook her head no in response and kept on. "They used this big thing with a lever to crank him up out the river. He had been in there for days. He had so much blood and water in him, he was swole up 2-3 times his size. You could barely recognize him. It was so bad the coroner put him straight in the casket. Somebody came by the house to tell Daddy what happened. He spoke soft so Mama wouldn't hear, about her favorite brother. Mama was lurking around the corner and heard it all and just started screaming, 'Elbert!' She screamed so long and so hard she passed out. For the rest of her days, she would have to get a tranquilizer here and there to calm her down when she would get to screaming or moaning nonstop, even on her deathbed. At this point, Grandma was hugging herself. I still get chills. 'Who did it?' I asked. I don't know. They put out a rumor saying he had been carrying on with somebody's wife at the NAACP. Somebody else put out he'd been carrying on with a white woman. Grandma, that doesn't make sense. That's what some people say. Before I could ask another question, she said, okay, I don't want to talk about anything else unpleasant. Let's talk about something else. I was about 8 or 9 the first time she shared that story with me. The couple times that I tried to ask her more about it or ask more details, she refused or said, I don't remember. On a few occasions, she mentioned a story that involved Uncle Elbert, but I always cut it off. It would not be until after I came in contact with attorney Jim Emerson and historian John Ashworth that she would speak of his life or death freely again. Little Laura from the Little House used to say, home is the nicest word there is. Oddly enough, me and my grandma's view of home was both in the moment and somewhere else. Our shared view of home was each other and the time we spent, but there was another home, a place that we both fantasized about. Poet Maya Angelou once said, the ache for home lives in all of us, the safe place where we can go as we are and not be questioned. For me and many of my family members, that home does not exist. Maybe it never existed, but for my grandmother, Brownsville, Tennessee had been a place where she thought it was home, where her family, even in its imperfections, offered a portion of safety and belonging that made her feel at home. All that was interrupted when a terror campaign ensued and her favorite uncle, Elbert Williams, was kidnapped, tortured, maimed, shot, lynched, and discarded in the Tallahatchie River. In January 2015, I received a package and letter in the mail from attorney Jim Emerson with information about my Uncle Elbert. The death certificate, FBI files, and pictures as you see here. This was the first time I had seen his name in writing, so that's how I knew that it was actually with an E and not an A, and his face. He looked like family. After a few moments soaking it all in, I called Mr. Emerson. He greeted me with a boisterous, how does it feel to be the great-grand-niece of a hero? And if y'all know attorney Jim Emerson, you know he said it just like that. The greeting shook me to my core. The original story my grandmother had confided in me was true, and there may be justice. Turns out I was not the first person Mr. Emerson had contacted in Michigan. In fact, when I called my grandma to tell her the great news, she got angry with me and said she told him to quit contacting her. My aunt had a similar reaction. My mom and most of my cousins were indifferent or leery as they hadn't really heard his name before. That wasn't surprising to me. In fact, many of the Brownsville and even early Ann Arbor stories have not been passed down to my family at large. As much as I was excited to be on the possible cusp of some sort of justice, I was also feeling let down and saddened by my family's response, my grandmother's in particular. I decided to go to her house when no one else was around and talk with her. She listened, and then she told me, I just don't want no parts of it. I don't want to relive all that. I was always afraid. Always. I don't want to feel like that. It was then that it hit me that the anger she expressed was just the flip side of fear. She was still scared. She then told me that she was even scared for me and my unborn child to return to Tennessee for the memorial. I assured her that I had a good feeling about the people on the committee and how one day it will matter that I made the choice to stand up and speak for our little piece of the family that was made into refugees. She began to listen more when I showed her the pictures and official documents that had been sent to me. Okay, I trust you. I give you my blessing, but I still don't want anything to do with it. My mom never got over it. After that, she went into her bedroom and brought out a Bible and a couple of envelopes. She shared never-before-seen photos, news clipping, and stories about her childhood for hours. Over the course of my pregnancy, we spent a couple more evenings like that, Grandma reminiscing, good and bad, about stories from her childhood. The key difference in her stories, I noticed, is that now she was freely talking about a whole section of the family she had never spoken about before. The stories of the family sitting around listening to the boxing fights on the radio, now they included Uncle Elbert and Aunt Annie. Her stories about school and little girl bully now included Grandma Mary, Elbert's mama. Her mother's cleaning and laundry skills were now attributed to her brother Elbert, who had shown her how to use a steam press. You see, the murder of Uncle Elbert was beyond his mutilated 31-year-old casing. Those police officers and entourage murdered an entire legacy and relationships and the ability to even remember certain family members or times without fear, without pain. It had shaken a whole family into silence. Now that it was okay to talk about Uncle Elbert again, Grandma could tell me about Aunt Annie, Uncle Willie, her Grandma Mary, the little boy down the road, even the dogs. The process of memorializing my uncle through news articles, the ceremony, and the marker had unlocked something for my grandma. I dare call it home. When I came to Brownsville in June 2015 for the Elbert Williams Memorial, the committee did a great job. Historian John Ashworth and Mr. and Mrs. John and Betty Duckworth came to greet me at the airport. I was amazed at the beauty. I've been to Texas, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, and California, but Tennessee was the most gorgeous that I've ever been to. The people, the food, the soil, the rivers and the streams, the beautiful trees and plants and shrubs, the flowers, the roads, the homes, the big old porches and pretty country churches, and the little frogs on the porch. I fell in love. I understood why Grandma had built so many beautiful memories in her early childhood. On Saturday, June 20th, 2015, we had a super tiring day, both mentally and physically, especially for a woman of a certain age pregnant for the first time in 19 years. I sat and talked with Mrs. Duckworth from one porch to the next, taking it all in. Around 9 o'clock, I went out to the back porch to sit and write my thoughts down, but I was just so engrossed in the beauty of the trees and flowers and the gentle night breeze. Then, in what seemed like a moment, the sky went completely dark. See, I live in the city, so we don't see dark nights like this out here. It was pitch black, and I couldn't see anything beyond the porch without my cell phone flashlight. All of a sudden, I got scared. The trees looked menacing instead of beautiful, and the breeze felt like evil whispers shared by night hunters. I thought, this was probably the same kind of night 75 years ago when they came and got my uncle Elbert to come outside into the darkness. I thought to myself, what a cruel and vicious act of terrorism my family endured. Water symbolizes life and peace and the flow of the universe. Trees symbolize family and growth, vitality and fruit and home. By hanging someone from a tree or dumping them into a body of water, it not only changes the symbolism for the victim and his or her family to death and despair, it serves as a public announcement to the entire community. On a spiritual level, it artificially emboldens white folks to believe that they have a say in who gets life's most basic resources and connections. As my grandma would say, playing God. The natural connection we all have to the earth's lands and resources and the healing and spirituality that is contained has been complicated since our arrival in the U.S. But using the source for healing, centering, and sustenance as weapons of mass fear is unfathomable. It's wrong, and it's exactly what happened during this terror campaign. When I came home from the historic marker installation in downtown Brownsville, Grandma acted uninterested. Then I showed her the program booklet with Uncle Elbert's photo, and she smiled and said, "That's my uncle," with pride. It was the first time I had heard her talk about him in the present tense without fear or shame. I took a civil rights calendar from the Equal Justice Initiative with Uncle Elbert's murder included and a program to my aunt, who flippantly told me she didn't want to look at it. I went to the next room and chatted with my cousin. Then she started going off. "See, that's what I'm talking about. They didn't even put my grandparents' names in the program. How are you going to have a funeral program without mentioning the parents? That's all Grandma used to talk about, how they did her son, Elbert. Now they want to have a memorial now that everyone is dead." I smiled, though, because in 30 seconds she had A, admitted that she had looked through the book, and B, Uncle Elbert's life and death had affected her as well. Healing for our family is not over because of the memorial, but over 75 years later, it has begun. A friend from my writing circle phoned earlier this week to let me know that Lil Bit had left her purse over the house. Then she asked if I planned to watch the Vietnam special airing later that evening. She shared with me that her late husband of 53 years was once drafted. My husband was drafted to go to Vietnam, but the decision was rescinded because he was just too valuable to go. Her innocent words stung and scarred my intellect as I thought of all the men in my family who have been sacrificed to war on U.S. soil and abroad. Dozens of my male family members have served in other countries throughout the years against terrorism and for democracy and for homeland security. My Uncle Leonard, who was actually my great-great-uncle and brother-in-law to Elbert Williams, was nearly killed in World War II fighting in Europe 1 year after Elbert Williams' death. He survived and lived with his wife until he was over 90 in Milwaukee. My cousin, Ralph Hargrave, was a prisoner of war in the Korean War. His torture included being hung upside down from his foot and then being shot in the foot and left for dead. A Korean with good conscience came by and cut him from the tree and helped him to safety. He survived and is still living and walking in this little limp at the ripe age of 87. My Uncle Donnie Taylor, Grandma's little brother and Elbert Williams' nephew, served 5 tours in Vietnam, 4 of them voluntarily, with multiple close kill or be killed situations, and saved many lives. He survived and lived until his heart gave out at nearly 70. Ironically, my Uncle Elbert fought for the most basic of freedoms in his own home, in his own homeland, with no weapon but the laws of the land. He, like my uncle, saw something beautiful about the idea of the United States we call home. Unfortunately, unlike my other uncles, he did not survive this terrorist attack by so-called law enforcement. Anyone who willfully chooses to forget the heroic, nonviolent defense against terrorism and for equality on U.S. soil by Americans, but swings the flag every Memorial Day, Veterans Day, and Patriots Day is a hypocrite. Just as the husband of my friend was much too valuable to go, so was my Uncle Elbert. He was much too valuable to our family, to the community, and to America. He, like any other United States service person fighting terrorism, paid the ultimate price for freedom. I make choices to speak up or shut up daily about injustices that I experience. I have that choice. In 1940 Tennessee, Black Americans were not afforded that choice. To even speak up about the murder could have been suicide. There was no Black person in 1940 or 1960 or even 1970 that could have sought justice for my uncle. So today I speak with the ounce of Elbert Williams' blood that's still running through my veins to make the choice. I ask you to make the choice to not forget them in these heroes like my uncle in legislation, memorials, education and educational materials, and resources and funding. If the story of my Uncle Elbert and our family merely upsets your own sense of fairness, you are making a choice to devalue and deprioritize his role in American history and the sacrifices our family has made and encountered in the wake of this cruel injustice. There is a quote I read that once states, "The past is where you learn the lesson. The future is where you apply the lesson. Don't give up in the middle." 77 years past the murder of Elbert Williams, we are in the middle. Now we have to bring others to the middle with us, or we will repeat the past. If I could speak directly to my uncle, I would have so many things to share and questions to ask, but first, I would want him to know how much his life mattered, how much his life still matters. You might find it morbid, but I often wonder about the final moments of my uncle's life. I could only imagine what he thought when the sheriff came to his home to take him away from his family in the pitch black night. I wonder what were the last thoughts running through his mind before he died. He suffered so many cruelties that I don't know if he died by gunshot, or by hanging, or by castration, or by beating, or if there was even a little mustard seed of life left in him as his body hit the Tallahatchie River. But somehow I feel like among his final thoughts, he had to have asked 3 questions. 1, has all my work, my life been in vain, Lord? 2, is my family going to be okay? And 3, why? As we start the healing process, we have to answer these questions individually and as a community and as the state and nationally. We have to answer. And that's all I have. Thank you.